Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome to episode 1 of our replay of the classic war game from Avalon Hill Afrika Korps. In just a moment we're going to jump into talking a little bit about some Axis strategy at the beginning of the game. Then we're going to play our first few turns. But one of the things that I wanted to mention before we start is that I'm by no means an expert at this game. So if you're watching this game to look for expert strategies, this isn't the place to do it. More so what I'm looking for is to learn some strategies in the game together and then also see what kind of a story this great game creates. So I was looking on, for example, Wargame Geek, where there are tournament level players that talk about the exact positioning of every unit for the first few moves, almost like a chess opening. This isn't that kind of replay. It's more to enjoy the story and to kind of explore some strategies and see how things work as we try them out within the game. With that in mind, it's time now to dig into the first turn. And the big question we have to ask is, will the Axis forces be able to pull out the victory here and change history? Or will the Allied forces win again in North Africa? I look forward to the journey, and let's get started. So let's talk a little bit about the initial Axis strategy. Simply put, in the beginning of the battle, the Axis have the superiority in strength. So I feel like we have to push that to advantage. So here's our rough plan. We're going to have the Axis forces leave the base down here, Algalia, and then slide to the east. At this point, they're going to split. We're going to send our Italian armor and our Italian infantry up along the road to try to take the fortress of Benghazi. That should fall fairly quickly. At the same time, we're going to split and send Rommel and the Panzers northeast across the desert to this gap in the escarpment, cut through and try to take Tobruk. Now, I don't see any way in which it doesn't make sense for the British forces to give up Tobruk without a fight. So that's where I expect our first serious fighting to be. Now, ideally, what will happen is the Italians can take Benghazi, continue on along the coast road, come down and join the battle in Tobruk. So we expect to see some sort of conflicts around these two spots, both up here around Benghazi, this fortress, and then of course over here when we get to Tobruk. Let's see what happens. All right, let's get started. And the first thing we're going to do is flip over one of these event cards. This again is a special modified deck that I've created for the game. 24 cards that are going to influence kind of things like supply and weather. Now they should be fairly balanced, but negative weather effects will probably help the Allies more because it will slow down, at least in the beginning of the game, because slow down the German offensive should they create like movement restrictions. About a third of the events are no effect, and the other 2/3 have some sort of effect on the game. This is a big moment for the Axis. All is calm. No special effects this turn. So here is what the Axis forces look like at the beginning of the game again. All of the units start in Aguila here, and unlike in other games, you have to station a unit in a base in order to occupy it fully. So it doesn't matter that you were the last one through it. So we're going to start by taking this Italian infantry brigade, moving that over in Bologna. Then the next step will be to take this top rank here, which is Rommel and his Panzers. They're going to cut northeast. Then we're going to take this Italian armor and Italian infantry and have them cut north to Benghazi. So here's the situation at the end of the first move of the Axis forces up in Benghazi. We've moved this Italian armor adjacent to the unit that's defending Benghazi and moved this Italian infantry just to the south. A couple of things we have to mention about fortresses in the game. The first is that in the 3rd edition rules, you can move through and adjacent to units in fortresses without stopping. So the zones of control don't exert beyond the fortress. Likewise, attacking across these is optional as well. So even though we've moved this Italian armor adjacent to the fortress of Benghazi, we don't have to attack inside it. Now, the second thing we want to talk about is the isolation rule in the game. A unit that is unsupplied for 2 consecutive turns is eliminated. So the plan here for the fortress in Benghazi is, rather than burn up our only German supply unit right away, we're going to try to isolate these guards for 2 turns and force them to surrender. Here's the situation to the east of Benghazi on the way to Tobruk. Rommel and his Panzers are screeching across the desert, trying to threaten the Tobruk fortress, which lies a little bit off to the east of the map here. Let's see how the Allied forces respond. So as the Allies, unfortunately, our strategy is not nearly as exciting as the Axis forces. I don't think it makes sense to push out to try to save Benghazi, because I think that's going to risk our troops getting cut off, and we just don't have either the supplies or the forces to be able to pull that off. So we have to, I think, The smarter strategy seems to make sense to me to play a defensive game. Now, we could conceivably pull back all the way and concede Tobruk, but I think both historically that doesn't make sense, and it lacks a little bit of panache, I think. So I think as the Allied forces, we want to try to defend Tobruk. So the question becomes, where do we do it? Now, the first strategy could be to kind of draw a line in this escarpment and see if we can delay the Axis attack, because we should be able to stifle them a little bit here. Or we could simply kind of initially fall back and drop some troops in this escarpment and put up our defensive front here and try to seal off Tobruk from the Axis attack. I think for the sake of playing a little bit boldly, we're going to try to draw a line in the sand here along this escarpment, just to see if we can delay the Axis by another month or two, and maybe try to get them to burn up some supplies that they will badly need for their assault on Tobruk. So that's going to be our strategy initially with the Allied forces. Here's our Allied forces in the vicinity of Tobruk at the start of the game. We've got some infantry in the fortress and this armored unit and infantry unit off in this escarpment. And again, we're going to try to build up some kind of a defensive line in this escarpment to stall the German offensive. It's also worth pointing out that the Allies have more forces far to the east, so we're going to start moving these units west with the exception of one of these infantry units, which will pull into the Alexandria base in order to hold the base, because again, you have to have a unit in the base in order to control the base. We change our plans with the Allies. The problem is this reconnaissance unit here, because in the next 2 weeks, this unit could move up into the escarpment, and then in 2 turns, it could actually cut all the way up in here to Tobruk. So in order to kind of answer that problem, we would have to hold something back in Tobruk, and that doesn't leave us enough units yet to be able to put this line in the escarpment that we were holding for. So we've ordered the Allied forces back to try to defend Tobruk in this line. We also have some more reinforcements coming from the east to Tobruk, as well as a few more on the road further off to the east. So it looks like our first battle is going to be trying to defend the fortress of Tobruk. Farther to the west in Benghazi, we do have one option here where we could move this guards unit that's defending it up here and attack at 1 to 5 odds. And that brings up one edge case in the game which says units do not need supply if the odds are worse than 1 to 2. So we could do that. The results chart would give us a 2/3 chance of being wiped out, but it gives us a 1/3 chance of retreating, which would stall these units some more. But I think that's a risk we're not going to take. Rather, we're going to try to tie these units up a little bit more by not moving out of Benghazi and kind of sacrificing that British unit to surrender. Let's start turn 2, the back half of April 1941, by drawing an event card. Hopefully it's not inclement weather for the Axis. Bradenburgers, German commando unit. The Axis player immediately removes 1 Allied supplied unit. Nice! This is pretty good for the Axis forces, although this might have been good to come up later in the game, but we'll use it right away. The things that I didn't show in the first half of April turn, the first turn, was that the Allies did receive a 2nd supply unit into Tobruk. So the Bradenburgers are just going to take one of those off. That will reduce the British forces in Tobruk down to 1 supply unit. Now that the Axis have a force in the Tripoli home base, they can start receiving supply units. They couldn't in the first turn. So, in order for the Axis forces to receive a supply unit right now, they have to successfully roll a 3, 4, 5, or 6 at the beginning of their turn. If they roll a 1 or a 2, the supply unit is eliminated on the way to North Africa. So this is a huge die roll for the Axis. Unfortunately, it's a 1, and the Axis supply unit is sunk on the way to North Africa, leaving the Axis forces with only its 1 existing supply unit. That's a critical roll. In Benghazi, I think what we should do as the Axis is try to get this Italian armor sliding off to the east to help out with the assault on Tobruk, and leave these Italian infantry divisions to encircle the fortress and force the elimination of the British unit there to capture Benghazi. The British battalion in Benghazi, they are doomed. Their effort in the war is over shortly. For the Axis forces, the situation seems pretty clear. We need to move their forces closer to Tobruk to try to prepare for the assault on the fortress there. Here's the situation at the end of April 1941. I was thinking we could launch an attack, but unfortunately, because the supply unit got sunk, the only supply unit that's left on the map for the Axis forces is this one right here. And if they consume it in this attack, that could conceivably lose them the entire battle if they have unfortunate die rolls in the next 2 supply runs. So we're going to hold off on the assault and just basically drop our forces around Tobruk and to prepare for an assault when we get our next supply unit in. For the Allies, the situation is clear. We have to kind of build a defense around Tobruk. May also try to send one of these approaching infantry units south into the desert to see if they can skirt the Axis forces and maybe create some problems behind their lines. Here's the situation at the end of the Allied turn in 1941. Their reinforcements from El Alamein have arrived from the east. They're building up a perimeter around the Tobruk fortress, and this is where the action is starting to look like it's going to happen. One other point of note, to the southeast of Tobruk, we decided to send one lone infantry brigade south into the desert to see if we can create some problems behind Axis lines. Back in Benghazi, the situation is dire for the mechanized infantry defending the town. They end the second turn out of supply and therefore are eliminated. Benghazi falls to the Axis forces. The May 1941 third turn starts. Let's draw our event card. So far, they've favored the Axis by far. Oh, this one does not. Severe sandstorms. All movement is reduced to 1, and no road or Rommel bonuses apply. Each attack total is divided by 2, rounded down. So this will be a quiet turn for the Axis forces, an unfortunate turn of events in their potential attack on Tobruk, because the time they're going to lose here is going to benefit the Allies. Once again, at the beginning of this turn, we need to roll for a supply unit for the Axis. On a roll of a 1 or a 2, the Axis supply unit is sunk again. Hopefully they'll have better luck now. Oh, the die roll gods are not favoring the Axis. Another 2, another supply unit sunk. They still have only their 1 existing supply unit on the board. In a moment of good news for the Axis forces, the May 1941 reinforcements arrive at their Tripoli base. They'll move them in. Unfortunately, they'll only be able to move 1 square. So this new panzer unit will end up here, as will the mechanized infantry, as will this recon unit. They'll have to wait till the back half of the month to get involved in the action. So the raging sandstorms around North Africa greatly hampering the Axis war effort. In Benghazi, too, more positive news for the Axis forces as the Italian infantry captures the city and takes the fortress. However, the sandstorms raging outside prevent them from really making much progress away from the town to get involved in the action at Tobruk in the east. The beginning of May 1941 sees the situation in Tobruk at a stalemate. There really isn't much the Axis can do. An assault would be futile now given the sandstorms and given the lack of supply. So the only progress that's made is this Italian armor sliding over from Benghazi inches its way towards Tobruk. But the Axis very much are in a holding pattern, waiting for better weather. For the Allied forces defending Tobruk, another supply unit slides into the city. They have now 3 supply units in a stack behind the city here. They're able to just tweak their defenses a little bit to kind of reinforce some weak points. But the inclement weather definitely favors them this turn. Lastly, let's not forget our infantry brigade of British infantry wandering through the desert. They make little progress in the face of the sandstorms, hoping for better weather to be able to skirt the German attack. That brings us to the end of the first half of May 1941. Let's head into turn 4. Let's begin the back half of May 1941 by drawing another event card. Now, the severe sandstorms one is probably the worst card in terms of weather in the entire deck, so that definitely hurt the Axis attack. This time we get expedited shipping. Each side may opt to receive its next turn's supply this turn instead. So the Axis will have a chance to bring in 2 supply units. They'll definitely want to take advantage of that, given their kind of dire supply situation right now. See if the Axis can have better luck this time. They're going to try to bring in 2 supply units. Once again, a roll of a 1 or 2 and they're sunk. Anything else and they arrive. We'll make 2 rolls to see if we can bring in 2 supply units. Oh my gosh, that's... I'm really not trying to do this. That's 3 in a row. The Axis have had the worst supply luck ever. Let's try again here. 4. Finally, the Axis supplies arrive in Tripoli and start to work their way east. With supplies arriving, we'll want to move these new reinforcements quickly as we can to Tobruk to try to help with the assault on the city. Likewise, as the Italian forces now have occupied Benghazi, we'll want to slide everything except 1 unit to garrison the city forward towards Tobruk. The attack should begin soon. Here we can see the Axis forces after their movement heading towards Tobruk to join the assault. In Tobruk itself, I think, unfortunately for the Axis, they need to push the attack because in June, the next turn, the Allied forces are going to get some pretty significant reinforcements that can shore up the defense of the city. So we have to move forward with the assault, otherwise it's going to be quickly turning in the Allies' favor here. I think we can bring this Italian armor down, as well as Rommel's panzers, and hit this infantry unit on the western edge, which seems to be not so well positioned. So this will be our first attack. The Battle of Tobruk begins. We've got the German panzers joined by Italian armor trying to hit this infantry unit on the western edge. It is 7, 4, 11, 14 to 2, but the defense is doubled because this unit is in escarpment, 14 to 4. At 3 to 1 odds, on a 1 or a 6, the British infantry will be wiped out. On a 2 or a 5, there's an exchange of forces, and on a 3 or a 4, the British infantry will be forced to retreat, allowing the Germans to advance closer to Tobruk. Let's see if the Axis forces have better luck with their attack rolls than they've had with supply so far. 4. Back defender, back 2. Here's the situation at the end of the battle. The British infantry retreats into Tobruk. I was thinking to advance the panzers, but then I realized that if we do that, we'll be able to, as the Allies have this armored unit come in here and cut off the supply of whatever unit is sitting there. That could be disastrous for the Axis forces, so unfortunately, they have to hold here. As the Allies, with reinforcements coming in June in the next turn, there's really no reason for us to push the advantage. We'll just kind of rearrange the forces here. We'll also only take 1 supply unit in because we're already at max supply, so we can't even take a 5th supply unit. The Allied forces have 4 supply units, and the German forces, Axis forces, just have 3. So we'll only take 1 and won't take advantage of the expedited shipping. The Allied forces opt to rearrange their defense of Tobruk. Things are looking pretty good for them so far. They're in full supply, and they've got a nice, strong defensive perimeter around the city. Reinforcements coming next month. Lastly, let's not forget our desert wanderers to the south of Tobruk, trying to skirt the German offensive and see if we can create some problems behind their lines. We're going to end this episode here at the end of the second month of the campaign, and things have not gone well for the Axis forces. British Navy has sunk 3 of their 4 supply convoys, and raging sandstorms for 2 weeks slowed down the attack on Tobruk. We're 2 months into the campaign, and they've made little progress in capturing Tobruk, although Benghazi has fallen to the Axis forces. In our next episode, we'll see if the Axis forces can kind of ramp up the efforts around Tobruk, but with British reinforcements arriving and Axis reinforcements arriving from the west, it looks like there might be some significant fighting going on. Let me know what you think. If you've got ideas, strategies, tips, or anything like that, please drop them down in the comments. Otherwise, have a great day, and we'll see you in the next episode.